What's up, guys? Welcome to another special episode of the Young Guns podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a team that has been making a lot of controversial moves these last 2 years, and they once were the favorite team of the NHL fans, and now it seems like they're public enemy number one. So. Today's video is sponsored by Bet99. If you like fantasy hockey, football, or other casino games, sign up to Bet99. The link is in the description below, and you could use our code essentially, which is Young Guns, everything in lowercase letters, a one. You have to be 19 and up to play, and you have to play responsibly. And also, our other sponsor, our new sponsor, is the Mind Foundation Canada. They raise funds and awareness to find cures for neurological disease and disorders. They are currently focused on mental health, and their website is also in the description below. And you could check them out to donate. And today, our guest is Ben Gotz, and he covers the Vegas Golden Knights. He works for Las Vegas Review Journal. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on our podcast today.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me, guys.
So let's get into the nitty gritty, essentially, of the Vegas Golden Knights.
It's starting off, we already have a question.
Yeah, starting off essentially with, why would they trade Max Pacioretty for absolutely nothing?
Because their cap was in really tough shape. I mean, that's kind of the box that they put themselves in when they got Jack Eichel mid-season last year. You knew someone significant would have to go, and especially because they wanted to bring back so many guys. They wanted to bring back Riley Smith, who was a UFA technically, but I don't think he was ever leaving. They wanted to bring back all their RFAs, which they have mostly done. Nick Waugh, Keegan Colasar, Brett Howden. They still haven't brought back Nick Hague, but that remains the team's plan, I believe. So they needed to let go of someone to make this all happen. And when you're in a flat, cap world here, you're either going to pay up to get rid of a big money contract, or you're just not going to get anything back, which the Knights have now experienced 2 off seasons in a row, trading away Max Pacioretty and Marc-Andre Fleury and getting essentially nothing in return. I mean, I guess it's slightly better than if you're Calgary and you have to give up a first round pick to get off a contract like they did a couple days ago. But obviously tough for the Knights to lose a guy like Max Pacioretty, even though now he suffered that unfortunate Achilles injury. But with how good he's been the last 4 years, for them to not get anything significant back is obviously a tough look.
Well, and I think what's interesting too about not only Vegas over the last couple of months, but even just like during the season, you mentioned Jack Eichel's contract. I think Vegas has done a lot of, and you mentioned it right before the podcast started too. They've made a lot of questionable moves over the course of the offseason as well. And I think, you trade a guy like Max Pacioretty. Obviously, we knew that there was cap implications that went into that, obviously. But I think Max Pacioretty still got, the potential to be a really good player in the NHL. I know he's 33 years old and he's been fantastic for the Vegas Golden Knights. So trading him doesn't really make any sense. But obviously, in terms of the injuries, it kind of does a little bit. But I look at Vegas, and I think a lot of the moves that they've made have been very, very questionable, in the sense that they haven't really addressed their needs. They've kind of just gone, okay, we're interested in this big fish. We're going to go and get him, and we're going to hope that we win the Stanley Cup. They go trade for Jack Eichel. Then they have issues with, there was the whole Marc-Andre Fleury situation as well, and how he was ran out of town. And now obviously Robin Lehner's on LTIR. There's a lot of question marks with the Vegas Golden Knights. And one of the questions that I think, to me, didn't really make any sense either is, they go and acquire Shea Weber's contract, obviously to be put on LTIR, but they give up a significant asset in Evgenii Dadonov. And obviously there was, the whole thing at the trade deadline with the Anaheim Ducks, where he, supposedly waived his no move clause, or Vegas didn't know that they had no move clause, and the trade ended up falling through. And so I don't really understand, especially in terms of acquiring Shea Weber, and obviously the price that you see for a guy like Sean Monahan, who just recently got acquired by the Habs, or even for a guy like Max Pacioretty. I just don't know how you take on a contract of Shea Weber's caliber, regardless of whether he goes on LTIR or not, and you trade up an asset to get it. Because I think, especially for Montreal, they kind of had no leverage there, right? They could have just thrown Weber on LTIR. So Vegas had a lot of leverage there, and they decided, we're going to give up a roster player who still got it and is still, 1 year left at $5 million for essentially a defenseman who's never going to play the game again. And obviously LTIR and cap implications go into that, but it didn't really make sense. And there's a lot of decisions that I think haven't made sense for Vegas lately that have not only frustrated the fan base, I would say, but I think even from an outside perspective looking in, it's been really like, okay, what's Vegas trying to do here? Are they trying to win, or are they just trying to like build this, hockey team that you build on GM mode, when you play NHL? So that's kind of been my like perspective on it. I don't know if that's what your perspective is, but that's kind of my perspective on it.
I mean, I definitely think they are trying to win, and they're trying to make moves that they think will push the team forward. The problem that they keep running into is that in order to push the team forward, they keep acquiring these, big money players that then force them to move players out elsewhere. I think they're one of the teams that have been most affected by the flat salary cap the last couple of years. But that's not to say that that's not still their own fault, because they're the ones that are pushing the limits of the salary cap when it is flat. I mean, the Dadonov trade, I actually think they didn't have any leverage. They tried to trade the guy once, and the trade got voided. So everyone in the NHL knew that they were trying to shed his salary because they needed to, in order to bring back all the guys that they wanted to bring back this offseason. And they've just been in that position so often over the last couple of years where they need to get cap compliant. They need to shed money, and every team in the NHL knows it. So that's why they're not getting these huge returns for Marc-Andre Fleury, for Max Pacioretty, for Evgeny Dadonov, where, as you said, I think taking back that Shea Weber contract is going to hurt them the next 4 years, but they probably viewed that as a better alternative than to go the, route that Calgary did and give up a future first-round pick. That, we want to at least hang on to that asset, even though taking back Shea Weber's contract isn't ideal either. So, like I said, obviously a lot of these moves I think have been tough look, for them. Not good asset management, just in the aggregate in terms of, even a year before this, they traded for Evgeny Dadonov, giving up a third-round pick, and Nick Holden. Now you're taking back an LTIR contract for 4 years, a year later, to get rid of him. It's obviously not good kind of, dollar in, dollar out business here. Even obviously Max Pacioretty, you gave up Nick Suzuki to get him, in addition to Tomas Tatar and a second-round pick. Now you're shipping him out for basically nothing in return. You're actually attaching Dylan Coghlan, who's a good NHL player, a usable NHL player, to get off Pacioretty's money. So I think that's the biggest thing. Like, it's just the asset management has not been ideal for this team. And for the most part, they, I think pre-flat cap, actually did a very good job of maneuvering around contracts and getting value back and making the roster better. It's just gotten so much harder in the flat cap era that as they keep trying to push the envelope by getting Alex Pietrangelo, getting both Marc-Andre Fleury and Robin Lehner in the building, then signing Lehner to that extension, then getting Jack Eichel in the building, the more they kind of push, it's just more and more difficult because that cap's just not going up and you're not getting any extra space or flexibility. And all these other teams in the NHL know it. So you're not getting, significant things back for guys that have been good contributors for you. And so it's kind of been this tough cycle the last couple of years that's made it, I think, harder for them to improve the team as a whole, even though I do think that is the ultimate goal here, is they still are trying to be as competitive as possible. But obviously the cap is making it very difficult, and it's squeezing them more than it is others.
And I have a lot to add in terms of the whole Vegas situation. We saw this team under George McPhee, how well he was, in terms of asset management, building a team essentially from quote unquote scrap that was, through the expansion draft, going to the Stanley Cup finals in that same year. And, they were a competitive team for years after that. So once Kelly McCrimmon comes in, he kind of, he starts making more risky moves, but it doesn't pan out in the long term, and essentially kind of erases George McPhee's success in terms of trades. And I understand why Max Pacioretty was the one out. He's been dealing with a lot of injuries, concussion past, shoulder injury. Now he's out for 6 months with a torn Achilles. So they probably knew that he was, dealing with an injury. So they're just like, you know what? We had Stone out for a good portion of the season last year. Robin Lehner, now Max Pacioretty. Someone needs to go here. So they essentially got rid of Max Pacioretty. But when you look back at that trade now, they got rid of Nick Suzuki essentially for nothing. And Nick Suzuki on this team, we all know, would have had a huge impact for years to come long term. Yes, they have Jack Eichel, but they had to trade for Jack Eichel. And look at Peyton Krebs, look at Alex Tuck right now on that team. It looks like they're going to be huge players for years to come. So, like I'm just not a fan of Kelly McCrimmon as a general manager of what he's done so far with the Vegas Golden Knights. I preferred George McPhee, and George McPhee, was building this team into a team that everyone was rooting for essentially. And Kelly McCrimmon is just erasing that and flipping the script essentially and turning them into a team that is very hated around the league. And like I was saying in my intro, like they once were fan favorites, now it seems like they're public enemy number one. So obviously they bring in Bruce Cassidy, who's a fantastic coach, took advantage of that situation, who I think is a huge upgrade on Peter DeBoer. I'm not really a fan of him. I won't get into that. But I think Cassidy's really going to help in the coaching department. But I feel like it's like they add something significant in one department, but they lose something significant in another department.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting dance the last couple of years. I mean, I think it's hard to separate the George McPhee and Kelly McCrimmon on this roster because George is still there. He is still, in the building. He's the president of hockey operations. I mean, Kelly McCrimmon was even talking about, when deciding, okay, what are we going to do with Pete DeBoer, and then discussing, okay, we ultimately, fired Pete DeBoer. George McPhee is in those meetings. So it's hard to separate who did what, even though, it was after year 2 that McCrimmon got promoted to GM. I still, don't think you can separate, he and McPhee's kind of imprint on this team, that there's at least some collaboration there. Even Bruce Cassidy, who just got hired, has connections to George McPhee. George McPhee gave him his first NHL gig as a head coach in Washington, and even said in an interview I did with him after, I shouldn't have fired him then. I thought he was a really good coach. And so I do think it is still kind of a collaborative approach with the two of them, even though McCrimmon has the GM title. But they are going to be asking a lot of Cassidy, to improve this team's standing, despite the fact that, they haven't really added much to this roster. They've actually just, subtracted to this roster. We talked about Pacioretty. They've lost Dadonov. Matthias Janmark left in free agency. Now Robin Lehner is going to be out for the year. And because of all their salary cap issues, they haven't brought in anyone from the outside yet. It's been all about, getting guys that they already had last year back under new deals. So in order to make the leap where you were, out of the playoffs to back in the playoffs and potentially making deep runs again, like this team has done 3 times in their first 5 years, a lot of that's going to be on Bruce Cassidy. Obviously, the team was really banged up last year, really injured, and so that played a large part in their lack of success. Not all, but a large part. And so, that's going to play a role. But I think they are going to be asking Cassidy to, hey, improve our power play, hey, improve our penalty kill, improve our defensive systems, help make the goalies we still have healthy on this roster look really good, because that's going to have to be kind of our formula for success this year. Because, based on the way that we've had to make the math work this offseason, the talent just isn't what it was in years past in order to fit under the salary cap. So they are going to be asking Cassidy to, squeeze a little bit more out of this group, because that's what it's going to take for them to get back to what they want to be next season.
And what does Bruce Cassidy bring that Peter DeBoer lacked, essentially?
Well, I think the one thing that fans are going to be hoping for is that, Bruce Cassidy's power plays in Boston especially were really, really successful, top 5 in the NHL over his time there. And that was the one area that really struggled under Pete DeBoer, here in Vegas. They're 25th last year. Injuries once again play a big part in that, but they were really, really bad in the 2021 postseason. I think that's what essentially cost them a spot in the Stanley Cup final. They were 0 for 15 against Montreal. That was just a really ugly period in what was a very bad postseason for the power play as a whole. That unit just never clicked, never found consistency. The penalty kill wasn't great either last year. So I think turning around the special teams is going to be one of Cassidy's main focuses. And then he's going to be, I think a lot about tightening the defensive systems, because this team has lost a lot of its goal scoring talent. So, under Pete DeBoer, they were a really, really good, offensive team, especially at 5-on-5, even despite the fact that they had so many injuries last year. They were top 10 in 5-on-5 goals. And I just don't know if they have the horses to do that next year. So I think bringing in Cassidy will help this group play a little bit of a different style, where he's got these great defensive systems. So they're able to play more tight at 5-on-5, limit scoring chances against, and then potentially dial it up on special teams, whereas that can now be turned into a strength where, before for the Knights, it really seemed like it was about, let's play even on special teams, then we can win the game at 5-on-5. Now I think that might get flipped where it's like, let's keep things tight at 5-on-5 with our defensive structure, and then we'll try to, outwork teams on special teams because they do still have enough high-end, talent there with like guys like Alex Pietrangelo, Shea Theodore, and of course Jack Eichel to potentially make that a workable strategy. So I think he's going to kind of usher in this new era of Knights hockey that they might need to be more successful next year with all the pieces that they've now lost.
Well, and I really like Bruce Cassidy. I think that was a great hire for them as well, especially with, kind of what they went through last year and the difficulties they had. But I think my biggest concern for Vegas, and I think it's everyone's biggest concern, I think the comments are addressing it at the beginning too, is the goaltending, right? Obviously, you lose Robin Lehner, who's out for the year, it looks like, and their goalie tandem is kind of uncertain at the moment, right? It looks like it's going to probably be Logan Thompson. And
can I actually add to that for a second? Our good friend Sheng Peng of San Jose Hockey Now, according to his report, is that they're starting the season with Thompson and Hutchinson as their goaltending duo, unless something falls into their lap. I know we had him on a couple of episodes ago, and we were speaking about James Reimer potentially being a fit. So, like, do you have any news on that? Are they really going with that tandem, or are they looking elsewhere for a starter?
I mean, it wouldn't shock me if they went with that tandem just because, James Reimer is a fine NHL goalie, but are you going out and giving up something significant, for him at this point in the offseason? Once again, the Knights are kind of over a barrel here where everyone knows they need a goalie. I'm not sure that he's a significant enough upgrade at this point for them to go out and get him, especially because I do think there is a lot of belief in Logan Thompson. I think Laurent-Brossoit is more of a guy that you kind of know who's probably going to be their primary backup next year. He's kind of been a career backup. He's coming off off-season hip surgery, so still not 100% sure whether he's going to be ready for the regular season opener. If not, it will be Michael Hutchinson potentially as the backup. But Thompson, I think, is a guy that he's only played 20 NHL games, but I think he's kind of earned a shot at this point. He's a guy who's really had to work his way up the hard way. I mean, he's a guy who was part of the Knights' first ever development camp. They looked at him, evaluated him, didn't sign him, so he had to go to Canadian college hockey and then work his way back up the system through the ECHL, through the minors, winning AHL goalie of the year a couple of years ago, now to the point where he finally kind of got his first extended action in the NHL last year. Went very well, got the call to Team Canada in the World Championships, and now he's potentially going to take on an even bigger role with this team next year where he might be their primary starter. And I think, if you're the Knights, the upside that he provides is a guy who's on a really good contract, making about a little bit more than the minimum next year and has shown some upside. I think probably Trump's trying to just go with a veteran who's just kind of, okay. I think if you're trading for Reimer, you're hoping he's maybe, the 40th best goalie in the NHL or something. So at that point, if you really are still focused on making the playoffs and doing well there, why not give a guy like Logan Thompson a shot? Because, every single obstacle he's faced in his career so far, which have been numerous, he's found a way to overcome it. We'll have to see, obviously, whether he can, make this leap, because this would be the biggest challenge of his career, especially once NHL teams, now that they've seen him, for one go around, they'll be able to scout him a little bit more heavily. They'll have a little bit better of a book as to how to attack him. But, I think if you're the Knights, if you're going to roll with somebody, I think why not roll with this kind of, young homegrown player as compared to going out for, a decent but not spectacular veteran and have to give up assets to do that. So I think, when you look at the options that are out there, which are not super appealing at this point of the offseason to the Knights, why not just give them a shot and see where this leads?
And we have a couple of suggestions here in terms of starting goaltenders. So here are the first one, Jake Allen. What are your thoughts on that one?
I don't know if that happens now that Carey Price is apparently going to be out for the year, which is what Kent Hughes said a couple days ago. So, Montreal's not trying to necessarily win the Stanley Cup next year, but you do need someone to be in net. So I don't know if they're going to give up Jake Allen at this point, just because if Carey Price isn't going to be around, you need a guy to play some games for you. So I think once again, that's probably, be tricky to pull off.
Yeah.
Well, he's a guy that I think if obviously we know, I think a lot of us believe that Montreal is not going to make the playoffs. I mean, we're Canadians fans, so obviously our our thought on it is that the Canadiens aren't going to make the playoffs. But I think if Jake Allen becomes available at the trade deadline, and if you look at where Vegas could become the trade deadline, right, if that does end up happening, where Vegas is not necessarily comfortably in a playoff spot, but they're kind of battling for that playoff spot with Logan Thompson in net, maybe they decide to go a veteran, presence in nets, and maybe they decide to go for Jake Allen, because I think his contract is good enough at this stage where it's definitely movable and you can definitely get a lot for him. And I think with Jake Allen, he's proven that he's capable of playing those games when he needs to. He did well in St. Louis. He's a Stanley Cup champion. Yes, he didn't play in the Stanley Cup playoffs when he won the Stanley Cup, but he still is a Stanley Cup champion at the end of the day. And I think that that's going to help Vegas potentially in the long run if they do decide to go that route. But I completely agree with what you said before about the Logan Thompson situation. I think they should give him a chance. I think last year when he played, he looked good. He was one of those guys that really came in under the radar. Nobody really expected him to come in and break out the way he did, and he came in, posted up a 9-14, won 10 out of 20 games, which is pretty impressive. And I think also for him, he kind of allowed Vegas to still continue to compete. Yes, they missed out on the playoffs, but it wasn't his fault that they missed out on the playoffs. And so I think that they should roll with him. I think the only concern for Vegas becomes that backup situation, right? Obviously, Brossoit wasn't the best, and yes, he dealt with injuries, but Michael Hutchinson should not be your answer as a backup as well. And so if you're Vegas, going into this season, it's going to probably be Logan Thompson and Michael Hutchinson. But I think at some point, if Vegas looks like they're a team that could potentially, make the playoffs, or they're in a position where they're battling for the playoffs, adding a more experienced goaltender that, has proven at the NHL level and can give Logan Thompson an opportunity to kind of keep growing his game in the NHL, I think that could be something that Vegas looks into going into the season. Obviously, the biggest concern becomes the salary cap situation that they're currently in. But I think that, they've got a good roster. I look at this team on paper, and they're not badly constructed, and I don't think they have bad hockey players, right? Currently, they're kind of missing some guys here, but they're a good team on paper. And I think that they underachieved last year in the sense that obviously with injuries and stuff, we expected this team to be a Stanley Cup contender and they missed out on the playoffs. But I expect Jack Eichel to be better. I expect, the Vegas Golden Knights to be a better team all around. And I think that in large part, it's going to be to what Jack Eichel does. If Jack Eichel is able to turn into the Jack Eichel he was in Buffalo before the injury, then Vegas has every chance of making the playoffs and making a run here. But it's going to be dependent on, is Jack Eichel going to be able to turn into the guy he was in Buffalo? And is their goaltending going to be stable enough to allow them to compete for 82 games in a season? That's, I think, the biggest question that needs to be answered, because we can talk about goaltending, but Jack Eichel is the most important piece to this. So.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see what Jack Eichel looks his first full season with the Knights. I mean, talk about a guy who, a year has passed and so much has changed in his life, where last offseason he's kind of sitting at home stewing because the Sabres won't let him get the surgery he wants, and he wants a trade, but it hasn't happened yet. So he's just kind of, stuck in, unfortunately, kind of no man's land for him, where I think this offseason has been obviously a lot better for him, where his neck has, been fixed. He's played hockey games with it, and for the most part played pretty well with that neck healed, and he's been able to kind of go around, do different things. He's back here in Las Vegas for a charity softball game, played very well in that. I know he was supposed to appear in Montreal for a charity hockey game. At one point, he's been able to get around, do different things, and I think it's going to be a lot different for him kind of stepping into next season after having a healthy summer to actually kind of work on his game again instead of just kind of sit at home and stew about things. So I'm really interested to see what he does. I think he played well enough in his first stint. He kind of scored at a 30-goal pace his first run with the Knights, despite the fact that he broke his finger pretty early on in his tenure in a game against the Florida Panthers, but didn't miss any time, just kept trucking because he knew how important it was for this team to make the playoffs. So, I think he's a huge factor in how this team is going to, ultimately wind up. Obviously, goaltending is a big part of that. But, if Jack Eichel is, capital letters, Jack Eichel, that'll go a long way to determining how far this team is ultimately going to go. And I think it'll just be exciting to see him match up with Connor McDavid a number of times this year as they potentially battle for, positioning in the Pacific Division.
And just to add to that, I don't think the Vegas Golden Knights are a bad team by any means. I think it's because we're so used to them being stacked at every position that now that they lost a little bit of that padding, now people are starting to freak out and be like, "Wow, this team is not as good as I thought they were." But like, if you looked at them last year or the year before that, like they had one of the best goalie tandems, but that we all knew that was not going to last forever. We knew that they had one of the best defensive pairings as well. Obviously that's still going to be there, but in terms of their second pairing and third pairing, still very strong. In terms of their offense, we're like, holy crap, they just added Jack Eichel, they have Max Pacioretty, they have Chandler Stevenson, who's having a fantastic year. A lot of Jonathan Marchessault as well. A lot of great players. Dadonov was almost, I think, a point per game player, or a little bit over a point per game player after the Ducks trade fell through. I don't know if he was trying to do that to make a statement, and that kind of like lit a fire under him, and that's why he was really getting the ball rolling. But like offensively, like they were really talented everywhere. Now, obviously, they lost some of those players. So when you look at the team, you're like, oh, but Pacioretty's gone, Dadonov's gone, Fleury's gone, but they're still, a competitive team on paper. And I don't know how you feel about this being a first line, but Chandler Stevenson, Jack Eichel, and Mark Stone. We know Stevenson, plays center as well. Do you see him playing the wing or center in this upcoming season?
I can definitely see him playing a wing. I think the Knights are going to have a decision there where someone has to move to that Pacioretty left wing spot because there's no real obvious kind of left wing in the organization that you feel good about doing that with. So I think Stevenson and Karlsson are the obvious candidates. And Stevenson in particular, Jack Eichel said at his kind of last season availability that, hey, the guy I probably had the best chemistry with was Chandler Stevenson. So it would make a lot of sense to me to kind of start this line out together. It does then let you keep the kind of misfit line of Jonathan Marchessault, William Karlsson, and Riley Smith together. Those guys obviously have chemistry going way back. Eichel and Stevenson have chemistry. Stone and Stevenson obviously have chemistry. So see if the three of those guys have chemistry together, I think could make a lot of sense. The question, of course, is like, is Stevenson going to be able to kind of up his goal production to at least kind of make up for Max Pacioretty? He's never going to be Max Pacioretty, but can you at least get a little bit more out of him in that left wing spot? I'd be intrigued there. I do think obviously Eichel is going to take a lot of the goal scoring responsibilities on that line, but I think it could work. I'm curious what Cassidy ultimately decides to kind of try out in training camp. I wouldn't be surprised if we see quite a bit of mixing and matching as he kind of tries to find the best fits on this roster, because it is a very center heavy roster where you've got Eichel, Karlsson, Stevenson, all guys who could conceivably play center in your top six. You got a Nick Waugh who could play, center kind of in the middle six range, but also shift out to the wings. So some centers are going to get moved kind of around the lineup. So there are a lot of options for Cassidy to play with. Obviously the one that we just talked about, I think could be one that I wouldn't be shocked if we see at some point during training camp, preseason or whatever. But I think he is going to be able to play around a little bit with this group and see what is the best way to use all 12 guys, maybe in a way that we haven't seen before, where, Pete DeBoer often with his camps were kind of, set it and forget it in terms of like when they did the bubble camp entering the 2020 postseason, he was like, here are the lines. That's what we're rolling with. We're good to go. Same with the camp entering 2021. It was like, here are the lines. We're good to go. And they were the same from day one. And obviously that was the goal of last camp as well, but it did not go very well because guys got injured so early where just the lines were in a constant blender the whole time. But I think he was very much a guy who kind of set his lines and liked to keep them together to build as much chemistry as possible. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little bit different with Cassidy and we have a little bit more of guys kind of, seeing different looks just to see what works. You're going to throw it together and see what sticks.
Yeah, go.
I was going to say, we all know that, Nicholas Hague needs to be signed to a new contract. But, I think that's going to get done. I don't see why it wouldn't get done. But I have a crazy proposal. We do know that they lost goal scoring in terms of Max Pacioretty, and there's a sniper who still hasn't been signed yet. What if they take a shot at Phil Kessel?
I mean, I personally love Phil Kessel as a fellow University of Minnesota attendee. I do love me some Phil. Nice. Yeah, I saw him when he was still in college. I was like 10 years old or something. It was awesome. The dude rocks. We'll see. I think the Knights are facing kind of a conundrum right now where you've got Robin Lehner, who's expected to, miss the year, obviously. So it's like, you can get $5 million of spending power, basically, if you put him on LTIR. So do you use up that cap space now, or do you wait until the season? The upshot, if you use it now, you can get guys like Phil Kessel. There's a former Knight, Paul Stastny, who's still available. You can get some guys that could score you some goals. The only issue would be like those guys, it's, a month plus in a free agency, and all the other 31 teams have passed on signing them at this point. So if you're the Knights, should you rush into that all of a sudden because you've got money available when no one else has rushed into that? Or should you wait, like we kind of talked about earlier, to the trade deadline? And if your goaltending is still an issue, then the trade deadline, after you've given, Thompson and Brossoit an opportunity, then you make the move for goaltending. Or if, your goal scoring is still an issue, do you then wait until the trade deadline to make that move? And you wait to see whether a prospect like Brendan Brisson emerges or something like that. And it gives you a little bit more flexibility if you wait. But also there are pretty, I think, clear needs on this team right now. So I'm curious, whether they rush out to address them or they wait until the deadline. I think they're going to be more patient and kind of let a guy like Phil Kessel come to them rather than rush out and get him, just because at this point, then you're kind of blowing your powder a little bit early. And plus, like I said, as much as I personally love Phil Kessel, the fact that he's still out there and every other team has not signed him to this point tells me that if you're the Knights, there's no need to hurry up and, sign him either, even though he's had a great run. Shout out to you, Phil.
They probably could get him for a league minimum, in my opinion. And I think it would just be an insurance policy in terms of having an experienced, sniper to replace, not exactly replace Pacioretty, but kind of patch up, no pun intended, what Pacioretty, left behind. But obviously, like you were saying, giving maybe the younger guys an opportunity to flourish as well. But I would see Kessel at this point signing league minimum, so I don't think it would hurt them. And there's also injuries that happen throughout the year, so maybe by deadline there's a lot more cap space that opens up as well. That's my thoughts. And Luca, you go ahead now.
I don't think Vegas really needs to address their goal scoring. I know people might be surprised about that, but I look at this Vegas Golden Knights team on paper and I'm banking on Jack Eichel being better. I'm banking on Mark Stone being healthy. We saw what Chandler Stevenson was able to do last year. They've already got Shea Theodore and Pietrangelo who put up good numbers as well. This is a team that underperformed last year with the roster that they had, with the injuries that they had. And I think that Vegas, under a full season, with guys healthy, with a coach in Bruce Cassidy who we've seen get the best out of players in some extent, and also younger guys, maybe not so much. Obviously, we've seen the situation with Jake DeBrusk. But if you look at what he's done to guys like Brad Marchand, Pasternak, and Bergeron, for example, right, who are already really good elite players, but Cassidy took them to another level, it's a positive sign if you're a Vegas fan. And I don't necessarily think they need goal scoring. Obviously, it's always good to have, and it's always good to have as much scoring as possible. I think if you're Vegas, you stand pat, you kind of do what you need to do here. Start the season, kind of see in the prospect pool if you've got anybody that could potentially, crack the roster. I know they have that forward Pavel Dorofeyev, who looks like a guy that could potentially, make the team at some point. And there's other guys as well. But I think the big question, there's guys like Riley Smith who they signed to a contract extension as well, who I think could have a better year. So I look at Vegas and I think to myself, this is a team that underperformed. And I don't think they're in a rush, kind of like you mentioned, to go and make a move for a forward of Phil Kessel's stature. Now, if Phil Kessel were to sign for the Vegas Golden Knights, I would think that that's a good signing for them as well because it provides them depth. However, like you said, let Phil Kessel come to them and not necessarily rush into it if they were to go that route. For me, I'm not concerned with the Golden Knights that much in terms of their roster. I think they're a team that is going to do what they need to do to make the playoffs because Vegas has found a way before, and I think that they're going to find a way again. My only issue, I would say, is let's see how well Logan Thompson does under a full season in the NHL with the pressure of him being the starting goalie and how that's going to handle. I think if Vegas can figure that out, and I think if they can find out quickly that Logan Thompson is going to be their guy, then I think they've got all the pieces and the tools necessary to have a successful season. And I don't really think they need to go on and add anybody at this point because they don't really have the cap space to do it. And I think when you come to the trade deadline, you're going to have more cap space due to the flexibility of the fact that the cap, moves up as the season goes on. So it's going to create flexibility for Vegas to go out and potentially make a move or two at the deadline to bolster their team for another cup run because they've got a coach that's able to do it, who's made the Stanley Cup final before. And I think Vegas, they're a couple of pieces away from, being a Stanley Cup winner. Obviously not having your starting goalie sucks, but I think with Logan Thompson, if he does what he's capable of doing, this team is going to go places. And I don't really have a doubt in my mind on that. I think, Vegas has proven it before. I think they're going to prove it again.
I think everyone's on the same page with us, being that injuries were the reason why this team underperformed. But a very good question here from Game Winning Goal Hockey that do you think Riley Smith would be a big difference this year too?
No, I think Riley Smith would help a lot. He basically missed the last third of the season with an injury. So I think that was a sneaky, huge loss for them. I mean, this team really, when he got hurt on the road trip that they ended up going 0-5, that was kind of the first signal that, oh man, this team might actually not make the playoffs. It went from like, man, this has kind of been a rough stretch for them. For once they lost Riley Smith, it was like, okay, the wheels are actually starting to fall off here. And so he's a guy that does so much for this team in terms of not only scoring, but, playing in all situations, being one of the best penalty killers in the NHL, helping out on the power play as well. So I think just having him back is obviously so huge for this team. I mean, he wears an A on his sweater. I think he's probably a guy that they really missed down the stretch last year as things were starting to come unglued a little bit. So I do think having him back is going to help out a lot if he's able to stay healthy, which for his career, for the most part, he has been.
And, with all this being said as well, I would have to think that this team will compete for a playoff spot this year if, they're healthy, essentially. And if, guys like Chandler Stevenson are able to play at the same tempo as they were last year when a lot of, guys like Stone and Pacioretty were out due to injury. But, as of right now, looking at this team, Chandler Stevenson, Jack Eichel, Mark Stone, Marchessault, Carlson, Smith. It's projected that Sakiri Maninen, Nolan Patrick, Nicholas Waugh would be the third line, and the fourth line will be Will Carrier, Brett Howden, and Keegan Kalsler. What are your feelings in terms of that roster right now? Do you think anyone is literally removed from that projected roster and someone else is inserted, or do you think that is the roster to start the season?
No, there's going to be different. The top six makes sense to me. Nolan Patrick, he's out indefinitely right now, so I don't think Nolan Patrick is necessarily, as of this moment in the plans. Kari Maninen, a guy they signed out of the KHL, I think he's going to have to prove it in camp in order to make the roster. But Keegan Kolesar is going to be in that bottom six. Nick Waugh, I think, is going to be in that bottom six. William Carrier, bottom six. Brett Howden had a really good year last year, even though he only played 47 games. And then they've got young guys like Jake Lecision, Jonas Romberg, who kind of got their feet wet in the NHL last season. I think they're going to be in the mix for spots. Manning will be in the mix for a spot. They've got some other young guys. Brendan Brisson, their 2020 first-round pick. I think, maybe not necessarily just come out of camp will fight for a spot, but at some point in the season, we'll kind of push for time. But I think that's roughly going to be the forward group that they're going to go with there, which, has a lot of guys that can pop in the top six. I think offense in the bottom six is a little bit more of a question mark. Nick Waugh's coming off a very good year where he was a half point per game guy. Keegan Kolesar, I think there's more offense there. Brett Howden actually had a very good offensive season. Michael Amadio, who I didn't mention, is a guy they picked up off waivers and ended up scoring, I think, 11 goals for them. So I think he's going to factor in the bottom six as well. But, overall in the bottom six, they don't have that guy that they've had in years past, like an Alex Tuck, an Evgenii Dadonov, that kind of, top six talent kind of player that just happens to be in their bottom six because they're so deep. They don't necessarily have that kind of middle six guy anymore. That's one of the things I think this roster is really missing. So they're going to need someone in that bottom six to emerge as that player. Maybe that is a Nick Waugh, or they're going to need a prospect like a Brisson to kind of emerge this year to kind of push their forward group from like pretty good to kind of the next level where they really have been at years past, where it is one of the deeper groups in the league, because that's how they achieved so much success kind of throughout the majority of their first 4 seasons, where they made 3 deep runs, is that they were just able to overwhelm teams with kind of their third line, especially when Tuck was on it in the playoffs. And that's the element that I don't think they necessarily have right now, but we'll see whether they, either find that during the season or, by the trade deadline, if they don't, use this kind of Robin Lehner cap flexibility right away, whether that's a guy they're able to go get at the deadline.
And I was also going to add, in terms of, their defense, Alec Martinez, he was out for a good portion of the year last year. And just looking at their defense right now, Theodore, Petrangelo, Haig, Martinez, McNabb, Whitecloud. On paper, that's a fantastic decor. And if healthy, I think it's, in my opinion, at least top 10 in the league. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I think defense is far from the problem with this team. I think that's actually their biggest strength right now.
No, for sure. Their defense is set. And not only kind of their 6 guys, you've got Ben Hutton, who played a lot of games last year as a kind of experienced veteran, as your 7th guy. Caden Korzak, who's a right side prospect who they have, had a really good development camp. I think you're probably, if you're the Knights, feeling pretty good about him as your kind of 8th guy, that first right side call up right now. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of questions about this team in terms of, do they have enough goal scoring up front? What's going to happen with the goalies in terms of, can Logan Thompson handle that season-long workload? And then how is the rest of the goalie going to shake out in terms of Brossoit getting healthy? What Hutchinson can contribute, all that. But, yeah, I have no questions about the defense right now. Obviously, they dealt with a lot of injuries like last year, like a lot of places on this team, especially Martinez. Losing him for all that time was really good. I do see those defense pairings down there. I'm guessing they're going to revert to what they had to start last year, where Martinez is with Petrangelo, McNabb is with Theodore, and then Haig moves back with Whitecloud. Those were kind of the 3 ideal pairings that they have, and they work really well together, where Petrangelo played better with Martinez than anyone else last season. McNabb and Theodore have played together a lot because they've been on the team the entire time the Knights have existed, so they know how to feed off each other. And Haig and Whitecloud are 2 guys that literally grew up in the system together, and they really know each other's tendencies. So I'm guessing that would be the group. And then, Haig played with Petrangelo when Martinez got hurt. So you've got that kind of versatility to adjust if injuries happen again. But, that 6, I think, is a real huge strength for the Knights. And then the fact that they've got a 7th guy that's a veteran in Hutton they can feel good about, a prospect in Korzak that they feel good about. That's the position, I think, that easily stands out for the Knights, where the other ones at least have some degree of question marks surrounding them.
And in terms of, like, a team that traded a lot of their first round picks, in terms of their prospects, like Nick Suzuki, Brandstrom, Peyton Krebs, I don't know if I'm missing anyone else in terms of their
traded Cody Glass for Nolan Patrick.
Cody Glass as well. They're not bad in terms of the prospects that are in their organization right now. They're kind of pushing for a potential NHL roster spot. So, I mean, it's nice to see, but essentially it's a necessity to have, guys that are going to take you over the top, essentially, that are going to be drafted in the first round. So I think from now on, they shouldn't really part ways with first round picks anymore. They should kind of like add, because it seems like, they don't have the biggest window open right now. And it seems like, with years to come, obviously they're going to have to part ways with some of the guys they have on the roster right now. So they need to kind of look forward for the future as well. I know out of the gates, expectations are really high. I know someone wrote that in the comment section. And then, like, ever since then, there's always high expectations. Vegas is a very, party central city as well, really out there. So they have to, basically top everyone, right? There's high expectations to begin with. So just thinking about that, they need to be a competitive team to be for years to come. And unfortunately, Seattle was not able to do what Vegas was able to do. So hopefully, Vegas's luck turns around, essentially. And, they eventually, get back to the finals, and this time, actually win a Stanley Cup, because, in terms of their playoff success, they've gone really deep these past couple of years.
Yeah, they've had, almost as much playoff success as anyone since they entered the league in terms of playoff wins. I think only Tampa, obviously, and Colorado, have more playoff wins since the Knights entered the league. And that's, of course, with the Knights missing the playoffs last year. So that is what kind of leads to high expectations. I mean, the bar is set, sky high, and that's, not even just the fan base, the organization themselves set that standard. And so it'll be interesting to see, can this team, with all the subtraction they've had in this offseason, live up to that? I mean, I obviously agree. I think this is definitely going to be a competitive team, a team that pushes for the playoffs, a team that fans should expect to make the playoffs. But, you look at what Calgary's done, what Edmonton did in their run last year, it's going to be a competitive division. And now the Knights don't quite have as much firepower to match up with those guys. I mean, I obviously still think they have every reason to expect that they can compete with and even beat Edmonton and Calgary at the top of the division and compete with some of the other top teams in the West. But, whether they are kind of maybe the overwhelming favorite that they have seemed to be in the past, where they just were so much deeper than a lot of other teams in the National Hockey League, I think that might not be quite the same case anymore. But, who knows, if they don't use, the money they've got with Robin Lehner going on LTIR right away, they can obviously add that depth at the trade deadline. So I'm really curious to see, how this team comes out of the gates. And then if they do well enough, I'm curious to see how well they're able to kind of complete their picture by the trade deadline, because that's something they did really successfully their third year in the league. And that's what led them to go on another deep run where they made the conference final in the bubble and lost to Dallas. I think this team, if they're going to have success, they're going to kind of have to follow a similar trajectory. So I'll be curious to see whether they can ultimately get there.
Yeah, and I think in the end, I mean, this is just kind of my final comment on the Vegas Golden Knights in general. I think that they've got a foundation there where, like you said, it's a lot about expectation. I think coming into, I believe the GM or the owner, Bill Foley, was like, I want a Stanley Cup right away, right? And like, so the expectation even coming
playoffs in 3, Cup in 6, or now at year 6.
That's exactly it. And so, obviously what Vegas did during the expansion draft and where they've been from the expansion draft till now is something that we've probably never seen in NHL history. They made the Stanley Cup final in year 1 of their inaugural season. And so I think for Vegas, like you said, the expectations have always been high. And I think they know that. I think the players know that. I think the management team knows that as well. And I think, like you said, they should expect to make the playoffs. They've got the roster to do it. But this is a team that has had expectations since coming into the league. And I think that they're a team that, with the roster that they've constructed and kind of how they've handled situations, maybe haven't necessarily made the right decisions at times, but they're a team that, is not far off from winning a Stanley Cup. And I think a lot of teams in the NHL can't say that compared to where Vegas is. So I would say that they're fortunate enough in that sense to potentially, go there and have a chance to win a Stanley Cup. But at the same time, they have to stop making questionable decisions. And I think they have to start figuring out, kind of like some people have mentioned over here, they have to kind of stop making these moves that are not necessarily beneficial for the roster long-term and more beneficial for the roster short-term, and kind of start thinking about the future as well, because this team is not going to be great forever, right? At some point, they're going to have to go through a rebuild at some point. They're going to have to restart all of this all over again. And so, Vegas is at a window where how much time does Vegas have before it's like, okay, we have to tear everything down and restart this again, right? And so this is a team that has to be successful in the playoffs for at least the next couple of years, because you're going to be hitting Jack Eichel's prime soon. And so you want to get the best seasons out of him in the playoffs, right? And so Vegas has to be careful in the sense of, kind of their management group and what they're going to do necessarily moving forward. But I think if they can kind of keep the pieces they have and build on that and learn to start playing their prospects a little bit more, and kind of like Christopher mentioned, not trade away their rookies, kind of like Nick Suzuki and stuff like that, and hold on to them and develop them. I think this is a team that could be successful for a long time. I think it's just a matter of, figuring out kind of that management aspect of things and just, not necessarily making trades just for the sake of making trades. And I think a lot of times Vegas has done that, where it's like, we're going to make a trade because we want this guy, and we're going to go and throw the world at this guy just because we want him on our team, right? And we saw that with Pacioretty. We saw that with Jack Eichel. They didn't have to go with Jack Eichel. They went to go with Jack Eichel because they wanted to make this team a better team. And obviously right now, so far, it hasn't really paid off for them. Doesn't mean it won't in the future, but it's just to say that I think they have to kind of be smarter with their decisions. And that's kind of my opinion on the whole Vegas thing. I don't know if Chris wants to add to that.
Yeah, in terms of like where I think they're going to finish in the standings, they're better than Dallas, in my opinion. Nashville, we'll see if they're going to be able to be competitive as last year. It all comes down to Johansson and Duchesne keeping up their production level as last year. Vancouver, can they turn it around under a full season under Bruce Boudreau? Winnipeg is worse. San Jose is worse. The Ducks are worse. The Ducks could actually compete, so we'll see about that, but they're still relatively young.
I doubt it.
Chicago is worse. Seattle's worse. Arizona's worse. LA, we'll see if they're able to do what they did last year. Edmonton got improved. Is essentially still good. They improved. Calgary, we'll see what happens there, but they're still by in terms of looking at their roster and on paper, still very competitive. People could either see them as a more improved team or just as competitive as last year. Obviously, Colorado is still going to finish first in the West and in the Central Division. Minnesota is still good. St. Louis is still good. So, as of right now, I could see Vegas finishing either in a wild card spot or third in the Pacific. So I think they're in good hands. Obviously, it all comes down to health. It all comes down to having a stable goaltending duo. But those are my final thoughts. I don't know if you guys want to. I think we should open up the floor to questions right now in terms of comments. So let's go with this one right here. Do you think Max Pacioretty was traded during the offseason for the same reasons why he left Montreal? In my opinion, I believe he has difficulty being a team player. Well, in my opinion, I think it was really due to his injury past, and they don't want to deal with. They already have enough people with a lot of injuries. So in terms of the contract and the length, and also his history with injuries, I think Pacioretty was the man out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just a cap hit. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. There's only so many guys that they could move out that were making his kind of money that would give him enough, flexibility. And he's on the last year of his deal, so he, wasn't necessarily going to be around, I think, for a long time with this franchise. So it had way more to do with the money he was making. And yes, I do think a little bit of the injury history, but yeah, I don't think there was any, sort of behind the scenes drama that kind of led to it. I think his just cap hit made the most sense to move out.
And our next question here, it seems that a game-winning goal has high hopes for Spencer Fu and Sakari Manninen. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, both. I mean, guys that they signed, kind of veterans that are coming over, that they are trying out, like Sakari Manninen. We kind of already talked about a guy that's 5'8", spent the last 4 years in the KHL, coming off a very good year internationally for Team Finland, where they won the Olympics and the World Championship. But they're going to get a chance, in camp, but they're going to have to prove that they're, better and worth investing more games in than some of the young prospects that they've put in their bottom six, like a Jake Leschyshyn or a Jonas Rondbjerg. So we'll see how those guys go. It's kind of tough to get a handle on exactly what to expect from them until they actually get into camp.
And it seems that this person believes in the Jack Eichel curse. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's something that's real, or do you think it's just dumb luck?
No, I mean, they're obviously not going to tank next year. And obviously for Eichel, I think it's partially dumb luck, where obviously the thing was for so long, he's the only guy in Buffalo. And then he's going to go to the Knights, this team that has all these other players. And by the time he's actually playing for the Knights, well, guess what? Mark Stone's back is a problem, and he's not playing with the Knights. Pacioretty gets hurt. Riley Smith gets hurt. And all of a sudden, really, Jack Eichel is kind of, at least in terms of forwards, out there by himself again. A lot of nights, not by, but having to carry a large offensive load. So I think it was really unfortunate timing for him when he entered the lineup for the Golden Knights. But I think he's going to have, potentially a lot of help coming in this next year. And I certainly wouldn't expect the Knights to be, in a race for Connor Bedard or anything.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions before we conclude our episode today. So NHL Power Rankings today has Vegas at 16. Thoughts on that?
I would probably have them a little bit higher, but I do think kind of somewhere around the NHL's middle-ish is probably fair. I guess somewhere in the 10 to 16 range, where I just don't think they're quite at that elite tier that they've been in entering so many seasons the last couple of years, or is clear, looking at their depth chart, like this is one of the best, 5 teams in the NHL. I don't know if they're quite at that level, but like I said, I think probably, 10 to 12 range. Maybe I haven't, done the exercise myself, but I think they're, should be expected to make the playoffs, but they're not quite, I think, at the high end of where they've been in years past in terms of expectations entering the year. We'll see if they're able to exceed them or not exceed them once the games actually start.
So we'll take 3 more questions. So let's go with this one right here. The Pacioretty and Monahan situation are kind of similar. Do you agree with that?
Well, the Knights didn't have to, give up a first-round pick to get off of Pacioretty. I guess that's at least a plus for them. But obviously, yeah, Monahan coming off injuries too. Pacioretty I think has had more recent success than Sean Monahan. But yeah, both times. I mean, I think teams having to trade away veteran players that have done a lot for those organizations, just because that's how the math has to work right now on the flat salary cap. In order to bring guys in, which for Calgary was Nazem Kadri, for the Knights it was bringing back Riley Smith and a lot of their RFAs. Someone has to go out, and it's kind of how it's working right now.
And they'll take 2 more. So why didn't they keep Marc-Andre Fleury? He just signed a 2-year contract in Minnesota Wild. They showed no loyalty to him, and they didn't even call him the face of the franchise at the time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is something that I think Knights fans are going to debate forever or be angry about for a very long time. Obviously, when the Knights made that move, I think they were very confident in Robin Lehner as a younger, cheaper goaltender at the time that they thought could still provide them with a consistent high level of play. Obviously, a lot of things have not gone their way since then in terms of Lehner was hurt for quite a bit of last year, though there were stretches he played really, really well. Now, obviously, he's expected to miss all of this next year, which is far from ideal for the Knights, whereas, Fleury, I think, had a rough go in Chicago, was a little bit better in Minnesota, not a great run in the playoffs, but now is back with the Wild. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Fleury does this season with the Wild, with kind of a full training camp and everything, because I think a lot of Knights fans are going to be watching to be like, all right, we don't even have Leonard playing for us this season. What have we missed out on with Fleury now on another team? There's obviously could be a full hour-length podcast breaking down that decision and what's happened since and all of that. But yeah, I just do think that is going to be a sliding doors moment forever for Knights fans, wondering what could have been if they had stuck out with the guy that, I think everyone in the fan base, the locker room just loved so much.
And we'll take 1 more question here. I'm still trying to figure out why they fired Gallant and hired a rival coach.
Yes, the fired Gerard Gallant got, Pete DeBoer was actually Jack Eichel who scored the game-winning goal in Gerard Gallant's last game behind a Golden Knights bench. Then he got fired after that game in Buffalo. I mean, here's the thing that I'll say is Pete DeBoer, for the most part, did have a very successful run with the Golden Knights. This season that they hired Pete DeBoer mid-season brought them to the NHL semifinals against the Dallas Stars, brought them to the semifinals the next year against the Montreal Canadiens. Obviously, they did not go over the hump either time, and I think there are things that you can criticize about Pete DeBoer's tenure, especially the power play and special teams, but they did have a pretty good run, and now obviously Gerard Gallant's having a very good run himself with the New York Rangers. But it's hard to say that that move entirely didn't work out. Obviously, it doesn't look good that they're now on their 3rd coach and they haven't even begun their 6th season yet, but the move did kind of work at the time. Didn't obviously work as well as they had hoped last year, but now they're kind of hoping, I think, that they really got it right this 3rd time and that Cassidy's going to be behind the Knights bench for a while.
And my final question essentially is, who do you think is going to be the player that has a breakout season this year? My choice would be Nicholas Roy. What about you guys?
I think was a really good option. He had a really good year last year, kind of scoring a half point per game guy. I think he definitely has what it takes to potentially take an even larger step this year. I do think one guy that I could see having, a pretty good season if he gets back under contract is Nick Hague, which I would expect to happen before training camp. But he's a guy, he's still so young. And he's obviously got so many tools. And I think he showed last year that he can play an elevated role when called upon. So I wouldn't be shocked if, once he gets back into the fold and once he starts to learn Bruce Cassidy's system, that Nick Hague is a guy that a lot of people are talking about a lot more a year from now than they necessarily are right now.
And who's your pick, Luca?
I'm going to go with Logan Thompson. Now, I know last year he didn't have a bad year, but I'm going to go with Logan Thompson for one reason. I think this is his opportunity to kind of break out at the NHL level here. We talked about it before that they've missed goaltending. I think if Logan Thompson plays like an NHL starter, like a goaltender that I think a lot of people expect him to be, the goalie that he was in the AHL, the one, rookie goalie of the year, and stuff like that. I think he's a guy that definitely breaks out for the Vegas Golden Knights this year. He kind of broke out a little bit last year and bursted onto the scene, but I think this year with the pressure that's on him, I think he's going to be able to handle that pressure, and he's going to break out and be a really good player. So I would say him. And I think the other one, if I would have to just name another player, I think Riley Smith's a guy that could do a lot more, good things. I think he's another guy that on a healthy season could be a guy that scores you 25, 30 goals potentially for the Vegas Golden Knights. So I would say those are the two guys that I would potentially say as my breakout guys.
Well, guys, that concludes our episode today. We just wanted to give a special thanks to Ben for coming on today and, essentially giving us his thoughts on terms of what to expect for the Vegas Golden Knights this upcoming season, and also giving an analysis in terms of their offseason this year. So we hope that you had a good time on our podcast today.
I did. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
You're welcome. And thanks once again, everyone who has tuned in. We really appreciate every single one of you guys. So thank you for commenting in the comment section as well. We always love the engagement. We always encourage it. And with that being said, guys, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already, and share this to anyone who may be interested, especially the Vegas Golden Knight fans. Thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Young Guns Podcast.